Yeah, no. Will the music continue as loud
I think
through the
so.
program?
Okay, I'm going to use my singing voice right now to get past the joyous celebrations from the other side. Good morning. Thank you for coming out on a misty, moisty morning to listen to a discussion.
Is that background music or is that a
It
program?
should end.
I think
Ended.
it should end.
Louder than this? Okay. To listen to a discussion on why a classical library of Indian texts. Very distinguished panelists, both my teacher, Sheldon Pollock was my teacher. Very briefly, in the last century, in a galaxy far, far away, we used to work on the same text. Sheldon Pollock is now the Arvind Raghunathan Professor of South Asian Studies at Columbia University. He is also a Padma Shri. Girish Karnad needs no introduction in India. Padma Bhushan, Jnanapeeth, my great hero, a man who's taught me how to be a public intellectual, a man who is never afraid to say what he thinks, even when he is sometimes wrong. So it is an enormous privilege. Keep it down.
Will that
But then they
music go
can't hear
down
me.
or will it stay on?
Yeah?
2 minutes.
Can you hear me if it's like this? Madam.
Let's wait for it to go down so we can hear what you say.
Okay, now you can. So it's a great honor for me to be with these two gentlemen on a panel that discusses things very, very close to my heart, classical texts. I'm going to let Girish start with this because, thank you very much. Hello? Hello? Oh, there we are. I'm going to let Girish start our discussion and sort of introduce us to how Sheldon Pollock is actually the best man for this job.
Yes. Well, let me say how overwhelmed I am at the thought of being here, really, and also how delighted because so many different streams in my life seem to have come here at this particular moment. There is, of course, I was worked for Oxford University Press, so I have for many years, so I have some pride in university presses and the work they have done, and of course one admires the Harvard University Press for all they have done. Of course, the Loeb classics, which were published in 1911 and published Greek and Roman literature, who provide the ancestry to the Murty classics, which we are going to discuss. The Murty family, which comes from Bangalore, and they are very close friends, at least the parents, Narayan Murty, Sudha Murty. Narayan Murty is a legend in the industrial world. Sudha Murty is a well-known writer. And Rohan I know as a younger generation and whom I have admired in the way he has developed this. And well, I mean, there's the text itself, the literature, which is extraordinary. But I particularly want to talk on one particular, the extraordinary thing about this is Shelley himself. You don't mind my calling you Shelley?
No.
Sorry, it will be very difficult to keep saying Mr. Pollock. Has said that this series is something that the world has never seen before, something that India has never seen before. Now, you don't often get a moment when you are where things are going to happen which you have never seen before in our long history. But I think the Murty classics will do it, and I'm delighted to be associated with it, at least at its inception. Now, as for Shelley, I met him in the 80s when there was a Festival of India, and as a part of the Festival of India, there was a seminar in Chicago.
Right.
And I came there, and Shelley read a paper, I read a paper, and then I heard people sort of grumping that man was a communist. Now, that's quite a strong indictment in American society to be called a communist, and particularly in academic circles. So I was interested, and it transpired that he was being called a communist under the breath, as it were, because his entire approach to scholarship, I don't know whether I understood them correctly, but that is what I understood, that Shelley's entire approach was involved with the history of the text, with its background of the text, its political purpose, what kind of politics did it serve in its time, and what it was meant to function as in its context. Now, things you didn't ask in the academic circles because you just took the text as pure and simple and floating in the air, without any background. And Shelley's contribution has been enormous there. But really, and then when he became the editor of the Clay Library, he has been pursuing this notion through the years, actually. John Clay, a millionaire in America, funded this series earlier, and Shelley edited several volumes. And when he edited the volume of Uttaramcharit, the later history of Rama, the idea is the same, that you have a Sanskrit text on one side, the English translation on the other. The one way in which the present series differs is that it doesn't have an introduction by a general intellectual. Is that right? Well, anyway, I was asked to answer that.
I'll come to that.
I was asked to write an introduction, which I was very flattered by because I'm not a scholar of Sanskrit, and I wrote an introduction, and Shelley included it in his book. But really, it was about 7 or 8 years ago when I came to Jaipur, and I met Dr. Dayakrishna, professor of philosophy, as you know, and a professor of philosophy who was quite a kind of not a comfortable professor. He sort of pinpricked everyone. I mean, he kept questioning concepts that were being used and how they were relevant to present context. How was Indian philosophy relevant to present context, and so on and so on, and therefore not very popular among philosophical circles. And Dayakrishna, when I met him, said, "Have you seen this marvelous book? Just see this," and handed me a book which was called The Language of Gods in the World of Men by Sheldon Pollock. Well, anything Dayakrishna says, you don't sort of ignore. So I immediately went and bought the book, and I was absolutely astounded by the book. And any one of you who's interested in the culture, I'm talking of this book while I'm introducing Murty classics, because it's very relevant as a background to the Murty classical series of what he has done, which is that the language of gods in the world of men is actually, if I'm summarizing it correctly, it's a very complex book and a huge tome, is actually a mapping of how Indian languages moved across the continent, particularly Sanskrit, but also other languages, moved in importance, in geographical things, how they confronted each other, they withdrew, how they came forward. For instance, how did Sanskrit, without any army to back it, became the language which was the model for Bali and Indonesia and so on. It was being used in Now, what was it that the Sanskrit language provided to these faraway countries that it should become a model of behavior? Similarly, his analysis, this I know because I come from Karnataka, and his analysis of how Kannada moved Sanskrit back in the 8th to 9th century. Sanskrit was the hegemonic language, and slowly from being a documentary language, it gave place to Kannada as a court language and then as a literary language. And how did that happen? Without any confrontation, while taking things from Sanskrit and imbibing it, and so on and so on. It was absolutely, a brilliant analysis. It still is a brilliant analysis. But I mention this in some detail because you just cannot have anyone edit a series like Murty Classics. It's not like a professor sitting there and saying, "Give me a text. Yes, this is from Urdu, and this is from Punjabi," and put it together. You need an editor who's sensitive to the relationships that govern these various languages, how they have moved through history. And if you really want to know how acutely and how astutely Shelley has studied it, you must read The Language of Gods in the World of Men. Now, having said that, I come back to you.
Thank you,
Girish. That's really sweet.
for that context.
I hope I summarized you correctly.
did.
I have another context to add to this conference that Girish just mentioned, where Shelley was whispered about as a communist. They were these men presenting paper. I was the chai girl, right? I was at that conference in 1986, and I was the one serving tea and coffee. And look where I am now. So, it pays to be a chai girl.
You can still give us coffee. That's all right.
Shelley has his own coffee bearer, but I can get you some. So thank you, Girish. That was a very important setting for why Shelley is the person to do this. But Shelley, before the Murty Library, there's the Clay Library,
Right,
which
right.
also you edited and sort of, the New Indian word is helmed. You helmed
it.
the Clay
Right,
Library.
right,
So
right.
can you tell us how these libraries are similar or different, and what is your instinct? What is your, what's driving you with the Murty Library?
Well, first, let me just say what a wonderful pleasure it is to be in the presence of two old friends. All the stories that I would have told have just been told, but I do want to say that Arshia's PhD dissertation at the University of Chicago was a fabulous piece of work. I don't know if I ever told you that.
You didn't.
And
Thank you for
oh, there you go. And I also want to say that when Girish said, oh, he's not really a Sanskrit scholar, at the conference he mentioned, the most brilliant piece that was presented was Girish Karnad's analysis of the Uttaramacharita. And when that book was published in the Clay Library, renamed Rama's Last Act, I wanted to have a preface by Girish Karnad that reflected the brilliance of that old piece. Now, let me just say, by way of segue into Arshia's question, the Clay Sanskrit Library was established around 2003 or 4 by a wonderful patron of the arts and of good works in New York City, an Englishman named John Clay, who himself had a degree in classics and Sanskrit from Oxford in the 60s. And John's vision was a relatively small, self-contained library of rather expensive but quite lovely books with transliteration, that's to say Roman, the Sanskrit text in Roman script on one side, a very curious but he thought pedagogically helpful transliteration system, the English translation on the right, very slim introductions, very few notes, and no distribution in India. So when I became the full editor of the Clay Sanskrit Library, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to turn the left side of the page into something readable, something in Nagari that people could actually use. I wanted to have prefaces by South Asian notables, such as this gentleman, and I had a whole list of fabulous people who had agreed to write prefaces. And I wanted an Indian edition that would be affordable to the people of India. Well, unfortunately, none of that worked out. The library had reached its limit, and John unfortunately passed away 6 months ago. And the short of it is, it became clear that the idea, the fourth and most consequential point to raise about the Clay Library is that it saw Sanskrit as a fly caught in amber, so to speak, as something separate, discontinuous from the rest of the world of literature in South Asia, as if the people who wrote Sanskrit never swam in the sea of the regional spoken languages, as if they had no relationship to their mother tongues, as if they were born fully armed from the mind of Saraswati. and we know now that this is not how Indian literary or South Asian literary history has worked. To actually begin to understand this incredibly rich, incredibly complex, uniquely complex world of literary production, you need to see it as a whole. So that was the fourth point that I felt John didn't fully grasp, and hence when the idea of an alternative arose after John's decision to discontinue CLS, there were many ways to go forward that I thought would improve upon, build upon, expand upon John's brilliant initial insight, for which I think he deserves the world's praise. The Murty Library tries to do all of what I just said in the most serious possible fashion. So I'll say more as questions arise.
So, shall I go or shall I will you go?
No, please, please.
No, it doesn't matter. Because the question is, it's a question that I'm sure you have answered several times now, which is the use of the word classical. When you say Murty classical library, what do you mean by classical languages? You know, one knows that the word classical was first used for the Greeks and the Romans to represent something that was immortal beauty, you know, unchanging beauty, timeless and so on. And then it is used in Europe for the music of Beethoven and, you know, where it shifts the meaning. And in India, you say classical music meaning a particular kind of music.
Correct.
Texture.
Correct.
Now, when you say it's classical library, what do you intend? And in this post-colonial world, do you think it's a bit of a anachronism?
Well, in this post-colonial world, everything is an anachronism to some degree, but I think the point is to try to recover some of the powerful energies that may appear anachronistic. You know, let me start. This is a complicated question, and I want to address it with a high seriousness and academic complexity that it requires. This is not the sort of thing one simply dumbs down. You know, if you look at the original publications of James Loeb, let me preface this by saying I often like to ask a question back. Why not classical? Who owns classical? What does Europe do with classical? I mean, it's a Greek word. It's actually a Latin word, classic. I mean, it has, in fact, a social location. It refers to certain social orders. But when James Loeb in 1911 decided he was going to start the Loeb Classical Library of Greek and Latin, what did he mean? Well, he meant everything written in Greek and Latin until the fall of Constantinople in 1456. Now, nobody today identifies the classical as everything written in Greek and Latin up until 1456. In fact, the Loeb Library no longer includes any material before the 6th century. So even in that world, the classical has a very sliding, slippery, protean kind of existence. In fact, you could say the same thing about a whole range of other. Harvard University Library publishes now 4 dual language series. There's the Loeb Classical Library. There's the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library. What is medieval? I mean, what does medieval stand for? It's a term that arises in 19th century historiography in Europe. It's very fuzzy around the edges. There's also something called the Itati Renaissance Library. And when is the Renaissance? The Renaissance for the Itati Library does not include Dante. Dante is actually in the medieval library. So there is a certain slippage going on in Europe itself about the word classic. I just want to add one more thought about the classic from the European perspective. You may know J.M. Coetzee's wonderful collection where he has an essay revisiting T.S. Eliot's essay, What is a Classic? And Coetzee tells a very interesting story of J.S. Bach, whom we might say is the epitome of classical European music. In Bach's lifetime, he was not a classic at all. In fact, he was completely ignored. And it wasn't until the middle years, 1820s or 1830s, that Felix Mendelssohn recreated Bach as a classic. So a classic in Europe can also be something that is constituted by historical processes much, much later in time. And this is to say nothing then of the original uses of someone like Horace, who said, centum perficit annos, a work that has lived 100 years is a classic. Okay, that's by way of preface, of ground clearing. Just to say that the word is up for grabs everywhere. And why shouldn't we grab it here in Jaipur?
Yes.
We'll grab it here in Jaipur. But on what criteria are we going to do this? Let me take a couple of more seconds. You know, many of you have followed these debates, excuse me for using the word insane debates, about what constitutes a classical language in India. I've written about this. While Rome is burning and the Titanic is sinking, the chairs on the Titanic are being arranged, rearranged, and people are roasting marshmallows on the charred ruins of Rome. That's what's happening in the classical language debate in India over Malayalam, over Telugu, over Kannada, over Tamil. But there is a status of classical language in it. That is not what the Murty Library is talking about. The Murty Library essentially considers classical anything, whether in the domain of belles lettres, that is to say, imaginative, expressive literature, or in the domain of systematic thought, composed in this great area that I'm calling India before 1800. Virtually anything in that world can be considered classic. Classic is in part what people in India themselves have considered classic. I can go into that in detail, and I'd love to give you a brief seminar on the classicizing processes of traditional. And let me just give you 3 simple examples. You know, in 635, rather far from here in North Karnataka, there's a temple called Aihole. And in Aihole, there's an inscription by a guy named Ravi Kirti. And this guy, Ravi Kirti, was not a very good poet, but he thought he would write a prashasti in poetry and maybe get a commission. But he ends the poem, it's 635, this is Pulication II. He ends his prashasti by saying, see if I can remember this. Kavita Ashrita Kalidasa Bharavi Kirtihi. With this poem, I will have attained through my poetry the fame of Kalidasa and Bharavi. We have here in the audience the Indira Vishwanathan Peterson, the author, the MCLI translator, stand-up Indira, the translator of Bharavi. And for the first time, actually, Bharavi was included in the... Bharavi became a classic already by that time. If you look at the great Harsha Charita, a few generations later, 650, Harsha Charita Bana begins with a list of poems, of poets that form his tradition. This is called the Kavi Prashansa. And from Bana's time onward, every great poet in Kannada and Telugu and Tamil, even in North Indian Bhasha literatures, begins a work with a Kavi Prashansa, a eulogy to the great classical authors who have come before. And who does Bana talk about? He talks about Subandhu. He talks about Pravarasena, the author of the Setu Bandha in Prakrit. He talks about Kalidasa. So the classic, in part, for us, is what the people and the poets and the thinkers of India have constituted as the classic. And this goes on well into the 16th, 17th century, into the Bhasha world as well as in the Sanskrit and Farsi world. One more thought. This has come up before, and excuse me for repeating this, but no cultures are entirely competent to explain themselves. Things disappear, things fall out. There are vectors of power whereby voices that should be heard are silenced. And one of our books is the victim of a vector of silencing power. It's called the Therigatha, the Songs of the First Buddhist Women. This work is not in any Kavi Prashansa. This work is not in any library in India. There's not a manuscript of the Therigatha in Bharat. The Therigatha disappeared from India. It was preserved in Sri Lanka, it was preserved in Burma, it was preserved in Thailand. And in the 19th and early 20th centuries, people in Europe, but also people in Sri Lanka, Martin Vikramasinghe, the great poet, rediscovered this work, began to see its explosive power, and began to understand that although we don't think of works as having a classic essentiality, there are books that burst through the continuity of literature and attain a certain kind of historical salience. Therigatha is one such book. And I guarantee you, if you could pick up a copy or write me and I'll send you a copy of this book. It's 200 rupees. I mean, you're not going to see a more beautiful, less expensive book. And trust me, this book will be transformative for you. This is the first really organized women's writing in the world. And this is a work that fell off the map of Indian literary history, but that should be, by this other process, let's not call it an indigenous, but let's call it a resistant process, be called a classic.
Okay. Thank you, Shelley. I think only you could have put it as complexly and eloquently as you did. And I do mean thank you for that, because it's also a question that can be answered very quickly and with a certain amount of triviality, but you've obviously you haven't done that. I want to take this a little bit further. When you talk about one of the purposes of the Clay Library is to remind...
Murty Library.
Excuse me. Oops. Murty Library.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Slowly we're displacing.
The Murty Library is to bring many Indian languages together, to not, get overly anxious about, is this classical or is this not classical?
Right.
What is the period? But there is also, as far as I can tell from what I've read and conversations, there's also a very, very strong pedagogical impulse.
Right.
Behind the Murty Library. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Thanks you. That's a terrific question. The question requires a certain amount of background discussion. I mean, let me rephrase Arshia's question. These books are not just for rasikas, although we want to reach the rasika and the lover of poetry, the professional historian who wants to read Akbarnama and Wheeler Thaxton's luminous translation, or whatever. The purpose of these books is also in part to enable people to rediscover their actual text of these literary monuments. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that? Well, for one thing, you try to provide a really serious introduction. Clay never did that. Clay had 2 or 3 pages. Loeb has 2 or 3 pages. I mean, everybody, what are you going to say about Homer? We all know that there was no Homer, but he had the name of Homer. We all know that. But with something like Pedana's Manucharita, you need 50 pages about Krishnadevaraya, the Vijayanagara Empire, the relationship of poets and kings, the completely unanticipated relationship between this highly erotic poem and the vision of a just king. That is a conjuncture which is very unfamiliar to us. Except maybe in France. I don't know. Maybe. We need these strong introductions. We need great texts, really great texts edited by real masters of editorial technique. We need text-critical notes that allow the student to say, this text may be unstable. Is this the right reading? What is the meaning of a pata beta? What is an apapata? These were the most standard ideas 200 years ago, and 90% of the audience, through no fault of your own, will have no idea what a pata beta is. We want you to be able to understand that every text you read, there are 2 things. Every text you read in the Clay Library was copied again and again and again over sometimes millennia by the most careful, loving custodians of your culture. What we have in 2015 are sometimes fragments, sometimes confused things. Establishing a correct text, it sounds like the most boring, tedious, midnight, dusty philological work. It's core to everything we know, and we want to show you how we do that. We want to provide annotations so that you can confront difficult problems through the guidance of an expert. And above all, we want to give you translations that guide you to the original text, that to the degree it's possible can stand alone and be read, but also help you get to the original text. Now, the point of all of this is to entice you back to the original. We want as many people as possible to say to themselves, I want to read this text in the original. Some people will come up to me and say, oh, why is it not in Hindi? Why is the translation not? Maybe someday, 50 years from now, we'll start a Murty classical library with a Hindi anuvad instead of Angrezi anuvad on the right side. That's possible. We might have an audio version. We're going to have an electronic version, I guarantee you, within 5 years, which will allow you to push a button and change the Gurmukhi of Bule Shah to Nastalik, or to Roman, or to God knows, Grantha. So you could read Bule Shah and Grantha. And we will thereby have solved the communal script problem of India at the push of a button. But the idea here is to give people as much guidance, as much encouragement, to generate as much enthusiasm to go to the text. Listen, you saw Chetan Bhagat in the Indian Express, I think, a couple of days ago. You know, Hindi should abandon Roman script. Trust me, people, take a day and a half and learn Nagari. It'll be about a day and a half, and then a world will open up to you. You can sit and read Sur in the original. You can, if you're a Telugu speaker who does not have Telugu script, take a weekend. Take a weekend and sit down with Pedana, and you'll see how you can return to that world.
More poetry. Just one very quick question, Girish, and then it's a very small question. How many books can we expect a year? Because you're making a very persuasive case for everybody here to just run into the bookstore and buy these books, which of course you should. But after this lot of 5, the opening 5, are we looking at another 5 each year? Is there a plan?
We do. We have a very serious plan. I and my fabulous editorial staff, Monica Horstman in Heidelberg, David Schulman in Jerusalem, Sunil Sharma in Boston. We have signed up 36 authors producing 48 books. I have just signed up another one, the Alankara Sarvasva of Ruika, the fabulous 12th century work of literary criticism. We've just signed up Amir Khusraw's Dibacha, his prefaces to the Divans. I've just signed up the Kaviraja Marga, one of the truly great works of world Bhasha literary theory. So we're growing all the time. John Clave, may he rest in peace, John wanted books produced like widgets in a factory, by the gross. And scholars, unfortunately, they teach, they have lives, they get sick, they get divorced, they have issues, they have hard text to work through, they get confused, it takes time. Sometimes we will have 5 books a year, sometimes maybe 6, sometimes 3. But my sincere hope is that none of us will be here to verify this, but your grandchildren will, that by the year 2115, we will have a shelf of Murty books of 500 volumes spanning 12 languages or 13 languages of South Asia, including all the most fabulous literary works and all the greatest works of systematic thought. I've told Manju Bhargava, I don't think he's still here, Manju, the winner of this year's Fields Medal in mathematics, like the Nobel Prize, I'm going to get Manjul to do the Bijaganita. We're going to have mathematics in the Murty Classical Library, as well as a whole range of other truly extraordinary philosophical and related works. So we have I think the right word is megalomaniacal plans.
The question I want to ask is, does this mean that all future translations will be commissioned? I mean, there are some translations already in print which probably are considered classical. Now, would you have difficulty including them in the Murty library? We will negotiate. What will happen to it?
This is a good question. You know, when James Loeb started the Loeb Classical Library, the plan was to include classical translations,
Yeah, exactly.
like Dryden. They wanted to include Dryden's Virgil. Yeah. And for a while that was the case. I mean, for example, one could imagine an A.K. Ramanujan reprint of the Kannada Vachanakaras. So far, that hasn't been our plan, but we're totally open. We're totally open to, not just to commission, but for being approached by anyone who has a serious project. We are bringing out in 2 years the works of Mir Taki Mir by Shamsur Rahman Farooqi. I know Shams is here. I don't know if he's in the audience. I hope desperately he is. I must see him. But Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, the world's leading expert in Mir, has consented to translate a good part of the Divan of Mir. At the same time, we're publishing Chaudhry Muhammad Naeem's Zikri Mir, a truly fabulous 18th century autobiography of this quasi-Sufi, crazy, fabulous Mir. So the reader will have Farooqi Saab's translations and then a reprint, updated reprint with the Persian text. Because Mir's autobiography is in Persian, whereas his poetry is in Urdu. We will have those together, and one will be a reprint. But by and large, to get to your question, we may go that way, but there are licensing issues, and it can become sticky. So.
The other point about translations I wanted to mention, I'll come back to you, was, while yesterday you answered that it's not possible to have detailed notes on how the translation was done, one of the great things about Ramanujan's translations is he explains how he translated it, because there are various ways. For instance, Ramanujan talking of Tamil texts, he said there was no punctuation in that period, there was no breakup of line, there was no sentences, nothing. They were all written dense, one after another.
Yeah.
And then editors broke them up wherever they like. Therefore, Ramanujan says, I'm going to break them up as I like, because I'm in the age of printing.
Right,
and I'm going to put it on the printed page and then translate it to Now, it's interesting. It at least shows how a translator works. Now, I understand that you can't have a whole note, but would you have notes by translators?
We do. We give the translator an opportunity to explain herself at the end of the introduction. There's a note on the translation when the translator chooses to go that way. The whole question of punctuation and just how classical, just how authentic. It's like the problem of early music in the 1960s and 70s when they were trying to figure out the period instruments, the gut strings. I have disallowed virtually all the Videshi punctuation in the text. So, but on the other hand, you don't want to make these things utterly alien and unreadable to the modern reader.
Yes, quite.
So we're trying to find the sweet spot between utter domestication and utter alienation, somewhere in the middle. In the translation, in the presentation of the text, we have struggled over every single aspect to make this as accessible, but as different. As different. Because there's something I want to say is very important. It's another matter of the classical. Let me just take 1 minute to speak about this. If you look at the definitions of the classical in the Western tradition, they're all about, I'm talking about Saint Beuve or Frank Kermode or T.S. Eliot. It's about, they've used the phrase perpetual contemporaneity, that the classical is what is always already familiar to us. It's as if you go to the classical because you want to rediscover yourself. That's not what the Murty Classical Library is about. The Murty Classical Library's definition of the classical is perpetual uncontemporaneity, where you will discover your non-self. You will discover something so different, possibilities of being human that have disappeared, that have been shut off by colonialism and globalization and modernity, forms of hatred, forms of division that now define our lives. This world is a world of often real difference, and that non-contemporaneity partly defines what we think of as the classic.
Just the idea that in the Murty Library you will find your not self. I cannot think of a better reason to explore that personally, and of course I hope all of you will do the same. We have 15 minutes, so I'm going to invite you all to join our conversation. God knows Shelley has given us a canvas that is broad as it is wide, or tall as it is high, whatever. Many, many things that we can talk about together. Please raise your hand. Please keep your questions pointed. Don't give me the history of your family and why you're here. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
Before we come to questions, I want to ask you one final question, which is that are you aware of the political potential of your philosophy?
That's my question.
I mean, the point is...
You're taking my question.
Girish, give the boy a
point is
chance.
the whole argument that there is no single Indian sensibility. There are various sensibilities represented by various ages, groups, languages, historical context. You're not going to make yourself very popular with the present government.
I think there are actually two questions here.
If I could just follow up on that, it's quite related.
Let him ask his question.
Yeah, you might perhaps regret asking for a pointed question. So
I don't think so.
Well, I hope not. Anyways, to keep it short, I was interested in getting a clarification on behalf of you. You spent a great deal of time clarifying the use of the word classical in this library. However, I didn't get so much of a clarification on the use of the word India.
Good question.
Particularly because yesterday there was often an interchangeable use of South Asia and India.
Right.
What motivated the decision to label this as a classical library of India? And specifically in relation to Mr. Karnad's question, understanding the political relevance that this would have on the larger debate.
Okay,
Got
so
it.
I
Thank
can't
you.
avoid this, right? I can't avoid this.
Why should you?
I'll
Go
tell
for
you
it.
one thing. The phrase South Asia was invented in Washington, D.C. at the State Department. And I don't think that actually has an 1800, it doesn't get to our cutoff point. So we're not going to call this the Classical Library of South Asia. I mean, I'm a professor of South Asia studies. I'm a professor of a region that does not exist, except in the mind of UN planners and SARC bureaucrats. May they prosper. I have nothing against SARC bureaucrats, but South Asia, I got a query from a publicity person in London saying there are people asking us here about India. I mean, did the British invent India? One gets this, the level of public reflection on this question is appalling. Absolutely appalling. Where is Greece? What are the boundaries of Greece? What are the boundaries of China? Is Xinjiang province part of China? What is Greater Tibet? Is Tibet China? And who decides? What is India? Well, I mean, there were people that I hang out with in the 2nd and 3rd century AD who had a pretty good sense of a circulatory space. They named it Bharatavarsha, and they describe this in their books. And most interestingly, the books circulated in the space described in the books. Do you understand what I mean? The manuscripts moved around the space that was described in the manuscripts. There was a circulatory sphere of Indian literature, culture, thought, and everything else that goes with it for a very long period. This space had a kind of coherence to the Indo-Greeks, Indihe Hore. It had a conceptual coherence to Chinese who came, who called it Indu. I'm not sure where that comes from. It had a conceptual coherence for Arab and Central Asians who called it Al-Hind. The British were just piggybacking on 2 millennia of geocultural representations. And those geocultural representations constitute our India. Now there's some fuzziness here. I mean, Girish wisely brought up the whole question of Southeast Asia, from the 2nd or 3rd century on. I won't go into detail, up until the fall of Angkor Wat in the 12th or 13th century. That was a world that breathed Sanskrit literature. Khmer princes wrote Sanskrit poems on their great stelae. Why are we not including Cambodian literature in the Classical Library of India? That's a hard question, and I do have an answer, but it would take us far afield. You want to get to the politics. You want to get to the politics of the present.
Shelley, do you want to take Girish's question about the less abstract politics of the Murty Library, what you are doing by challenging ideas of Hindu classicism in a nation at a time when it's turning more and more Hindu?
Okay. Let me try to respond to this Girish's particular question by just very briefly talking about the political destiny of Sanskrit. There are several things to say about the political destiny of Sanskrit. Sanskrit was a maker of bridges, not a divider. Sanskrit did not divide us from them. Sanskrit produced bridges. It produced bridges to Buddhists from the 2nd or 3rd century on, or maybe even earlier. I just spent the morning reading Shiksha Samutcha, a great Buddhist text from the 8th century, in beautiful Sanskrit. Sanskrit made bridges to the Jain community across India. Sanskrit made bridges for every vernacular language in South Asia. It was a world of, Sanskrit was a world of cosmopolitan inclusiveness, not cosmopolitan reduction. And to celebrate Sanskrit as as you walk in the doors here, as you walk into the doors to this theater, you see this catchphrase, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. What is this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam? Does anybody know? Not what it translates, but where it comes from. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is from a poem written in the early 9th century by a Lokayata poet in Kashmir, Bhatta Udbhatta. And this is how the poem goes. Ayam nijaha paro veti ganana laguchetasam. It is a reckoning of mean-spirited people to say, oh, this guy's one of ours, or this guy's one of them. Udara charitanam tu vasudhaiva kutumbakam. To really good people, the whole world is a single family. That's a Sanskrit phrase.
Shelley reads Sanskrit before breakfast. How scary is that? Another question, yeah. The gentleman in the back in the brown. Sorry, I'm going to try and go front, back, boy, girl, something like that. So, and then the lady here. Yeah.
Thank you. It was interesting to hear you describe Sanskrit as a language of inclusion.
Yes.
Because I think what a lot of people have reckoned is that it was also a language of exclusion.
Yes.
In that it was excluded from a lot of, say, lower caste people, for
Yes.
example. So what did you say about that?
That's a very good question. Sometimes my Indian teachers, I have to name them because I have to do this is my Guru Dakshina to Pattabhiram Shastri of Banaras and K.S. Subramanya Shastri of Mantralayam and Madras. These men were very high caste Brahmins, and there were occasions where other people than them refused to teach me Sanskrit. Brahmanam Puraskritya. So there was a guy, I won't mention his name, in Mysore, a Mimamsaka, who said he would not teach me unless there were a Brahmin in the room. Now, let me. This is a very deep question. This is kind of the sociology of Sanskrit, which is never, a deep sociology of Sanskrit has never been written. I believe, that and I don't have a great deal of evidence for this, but hear me out for 1 second. I believe that the illiteracy of India today was partly produced by the events of the last 300 years. That there was a development of underdevelopment. He said I was a communist, though. There was a development of underdevelopment in the world of literacy. I believe there was a development of underdevelopment in the world of Sanskrit as well. We know, look in the language of the gods, you'll find references to poets who are by no means part of that Brahmanical world. There were very powerful discourses of power. There's no question about it. And by invoking my teachers, who were Mimamsakas, they always taught me, as Mimamsa does, you make the strongest possible Purva Paksha that you can so that you can elicit a strong Pratipaksha. So I want to say that Sanskrit is a bridge builder, Sanskrit is open, Sanskrit is inclusive, in order to elicit that sort of Pratipaksha so we can have a real discussion about it. I think the last chapter of who owns Sanskrit and who is excluded, that chapter has not been written yet. And I think you would find that when Grierson described Sanskrit in the mid-19th century as this secretive preserve of a Brahmanical elite, he's looking at an early colonial construction of the world. Things may have been different, and this is not to deny that there were. Every discourse of civilization has a compensatory or concomitant discourse of barbarism. There was barbarism. And the Murty Classical Library is there to help us work through, to critique as well as to celebrate.
That's
Thank you for that question.
I've never been able to think about Sanskrit as a language that includes us all, that actually liberates us together rather than individually. Thank you, Shelley. That was very, very eloquent. There's a lady in the front in a blue jacket, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the work that you do. My question is, how do you choose your translators? I don't doubt the excellence of the translation. I'm just wondering, is something lost in translation? I'm just curious to know. How do you choose your translators?
Can I just give a very quick response?
Please do.
I'm really tired of people saying what is lost in translation. Look at what you've gained. You've gained 3 universes worth of books. It's worth it to lose something in translation if you can get 100 more texts that are going to change your life. Sorry. How do you choose your translators?
How do we choose our translators? Sometimes they choose themselves. Sometimes we know people who are working on texts. The world, and this, please listen to this. This is something very dear and near to my heart. The world of people capable of translating a 10th century Kannada text. The world of people, that's the wrong word. The number of people, the handful of people, the 5 people.
The 3 good people.
The 3 good people. The number of people capable of doing the Kirata Arjuniya that Indira did, who's sitting right next to you. Okay, maybe 7 to 10 people in the world could do that. But Kannada, Old Malayalam, Telugu Prabandha work, we choose we will accept whoever can do the work. Bring yourselves to us. Identify yourselves to us. Fill out a proposal. Write me. We will. You pass our little test. Give us a blood sample, and we'll sign you up.
Well, there's only one point to respond to that, because you also say that you will aim at translations which recreate the poetic sense. Am I right in reading? This, in someone like Ramanujan, or, it was easy. I mean, you would see them in the Telugu translations of Shulman, David Shulman. So they have a sense of poetry.
Right.
When you have a translator who knows the translation but has no sense of what it sounds like in English, that you have a difficulty.
It's a real difficulty, because you have poets who are not scholars, and you have scholars who are poets. You have Indians who know the language as well and who don't know the English, and you have English persons who know the English well and don't know a word of the language. The world is full of dwandwas. We're trying to be dwandwa atita here.
Okay, there was going to be one last question, but there isn't time anymore. Thank you very much for coming. Girish, Shelley, what a fabulous morning. People, go out and buy the books. Expand your mind, expand your hearts. Enjoy the Murty Classical Library of India. Thank you, Shelley. Thank you,
Arshia.
Girish.
Yeah, it's very sweet of you.
We'd wish to thank Girish, Karnad, Sheldon, Pollock and Arshia Sattar for a wonderful session which is presented by the Murty Classical Library of India. The next session will be at 11:15. Also, the authors will be available for book signing at the Amazon store inside. So you can buy the books there and get it signed in the Amazon store. So we'll see you at 11:15 for the Twilight Zone between Arabs and Israelis. Thank you.
सात समंदर पार बसी है मेरे देश की दुनिया, धरती का हर कोना कोना मेरे देश की दुनिया, सबसे रिश्ता बांध चुकी है मेरे देश की दुनिया, सरहद सीमा लांघ चुकी है मेरे देश की दुनिया। वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, वसुधैव।
Brought to you by Rajnigandha at the Charbagh. Data partner MTS,